Oh, hello, and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. Oh boy, I wasn't really ready for this one. Time just sort of snuck up on me, but I tried to be on time for you out there. Even though the whole idea of watching things live, it's kind of funny. When there was before the age of the video recorder and then the digital recorder, and now online recording, the time that a various program would be on was something of a kind of like a pilgrimage sort of for the people that were true fans. Oh, it's 7 o'clock, this radio show is on. It's 9 o'clock, this television show is on. But now, where you can watch anything at any time, that sort of mindset has dissipated. But for some of us, we still like a bit of consistency for the early birds who like to catch the worm. But that isn't at all the subject that I want to talk about today, although it does involve the passage of time and how that defines musical trends, how the sands of time can wash various genres to sea, or maybe a tide will roll in and push them back onto the shore, like many a carcass of a dead whale before them. Yes, today I want to talk about when musical genres die, and if in fact any musical genres die, or if that wonderful metaphor of the tide and its ebb is the thing that really keeps us going where we want to go. So let's talk about classical music, first of all, because there were a lot of classical composers who were, in fact, forgotten after they died. The sad fact, but the reality is, most composers themselves are forgotten after they die. When you really think about it, the sort of mainstay composers of the classical tradition, you could probably count on a couple of hands, or hands and feet if you're all alone or into that thing type of thing. But when you really want to break it down even further, you could probably boil it down to, your two sets of hands. So let's think about it. Okay, Beethoven, obviously, Mozart, Bach, Brahms, Wagner. Who else? We've got to be selective. Liszt, Schubert, maybe Schumann for some people. I would say Bruckner because I'm very much enmeshed in that German tradition. Others wouldn't. We only got one finger left, and I would say Richard Strauss. And let's just add one more hand because we've forgotten the people outside of the grand Germanic tradition. We can say Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, Berlioz, Ravel, and Debussy, the great modernist or impressionist, let's call them, French composers. And who else can we add to that? So maybe Rimsky-Korsakov, the most famous of the national-minded Russian composers from the great handful. So that's 15. And if we want to add five more, we certainly could. But frankly, by that time, we'd be getting into the territory of composers that people who aren't super into music might be less familiar with. But even among some of the people I mentioned, they were forgotten not that long after their lifetime. Most notably was Bach. Now, Bach was someone who, in his lifetime, was very well known around his locality in his parish church. He considered himself not some grand secular composer whose techniques, whose composition revolutionized music, even though it did. He considered himself a humble church organist and a church composer. And not long after his death, a lot of his music was simply forgotten. The style moved on from the Baroque era to the classical era, and people were just switched off of Bach, if you'll indulge me in that reference that some of you out there in YouTube land might get. Vivaldi, another composer from an even earlier era, I do believe, than Bach, he was forgotten until much later resurrected in the 20th century. Bach had a couple resurrections. First, he was resurrected in the mid 20th century by Mendelssohn, and later on, he was resurrected in the 20th century by many harpsichordists, organists, and conductors. For example, Wilhelm Mengelberg, one of my favorite conductors of all time, who was the person who put the Concertgebouw Orchestra on the map. He had his Easter tradition of playing the Matthew Passion of Bach every Easter in Amsterdam, and that really helped to revive Bach as a composer that people wanted to know about, whose music they wanted to perform, and whose biography they then began writing. But for a good 100-year period, he was was totally forgotten. He had gone into obscurity, Vivaldi even more so. Now, what about pop music? Well, this is where it actually gets more interesting because pop music's rise corresponded to the development of the music industry. There was always music, but it wasn't really an industry. It wasn't formalized, it wasn't stratified, it wasn't highly commercialized. But in the 19th century, that is what music became. First, it started with the great boom in music publishing. Every home by the end of the 19th century, except for those who were incredibly unfortunate and poor, had a piano in it. And not everyone was a keen improviser, but music literacy among the general public in countries that were economically advanced, it was surprisingly high. Musical literacy was higher than the noun. By musical literacy, I mean the ability to read music. You have a sheet of music in front of you and you know what the notes mean. So the publishing industry between the mid 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, it grew exponentially. And what kind of music were they selling to people? Well, they were selling advanced classical music. They were selling simplified versions of well-known classical compositions, and they were selling what became popular music because it was at this time that there was a transition between folk music and popular music because that's what early pop music was. Early pop music was, in fact, folk music that was made more musically sophisticated, that was commercialized, and that was first nationalized and internationalized. Because remember, with folk music, it started off very local, and a few tunes made their way into a nation's folklore, whether it was America, France, England, Scotland, the various Germanic states, the various parts of Italy that were disunited for much of the 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century, people like Percy Grainger were writing songs that people could sing and play on their piano at home that were international in flavor. And of course, helped that Percy Grainger himself was a professional musician across multiple continents. Australia was where he was born, I do believe, and worked. He worked in Britain, he worked in Ireland, he worked in the United States, which is where he spent the latter part of his career. And he was writing compositions and songs that were very popular, not just among professional musicians to perform and later to record, but also for people who would play at home. Now, I did mention the word record just there when I talked about Percy Grainger. And of course, that's where the next great leap in terms of the music industry came in. There was actually one that came just before. Came only slightly before recorded sound, but this was the self-playing instrument. And I've talked about this before on other streams. The player piano, the self-playing organ. Many homes had the player piano. People were already using technology to get lazy. So yes, people relied on technological crutches long before the TikTok and the iPhone and all the other things that those young fangled kids are using. The player piano became exceptionally popular, and even though recording promised you the ability to hear great musicians perform exactly as they would live, the early fidelity of recording systems like the Edison cylinder was incredibly poor, where the fidelity of a player piano was perfect because it was an actual piano being played by mechanical devices built into this specialty piano. But eventually, the recorded sound technology got its act together. And by the middle of the 20th century, with the advent of magnetic tape, we get extreme realism. We're in the age of audiophilia now. And this has been very interesting because so many genres that were born between the advent of pop music and the mid 20th century, while they have declined from prominence, they haven't died in the way that if you were to talk to someone in the year 70, 80 outside of Bach's hometown, they might not know who William Sebastian Bach was. But if I say the name of various genres from the dawn of pop music to the mid 20th century, you will at least have heard their names. And if I were to play you the music, which I can't on YouTube because of blah, 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 you would at least recognize some of the sonic features. So The first pop genre, I would say, is ragtime. And I've actually interviewed the world's foremost ragtime historian, a man named Foundering, about this very topic. You might not have ragtime towards the front of your mind these days, but you've probably heard the name. And if I were to play you a ragtime piece, you would probably say, "Oh, I've heard that sort of thing in a TV commercial, in a video game, in a maybe you've seen the film The Sting, which used The Entertainer, an instrumental ragtime composition. Most ragtime music that was popular in the late 19th and early 20th century were the songs, were the ones with lyrics. And what if I were to say the name Boogie Woogie? What if I were to say jazz, Dixieland jazz? What if I were to say blues? These are all early 20th century genres that certainly declined in popularity, but who nevertheless continued to influence music far after they waned from the peak of their popularity. And their names and even their sounds, I would argue, remain broadly, if not vaguely, familiar to even the children born in the 21st century. Now, what does rise and fall and rarely rises back is a genre that becomes what I call the idiom of the pop music of the day. So, between the sort of, let's say, the late 1870s and 1910s, ragtime was the lingua franca of pop music. It was the idiom of pop music. If you wanted to write a pop song, and by that I just mean a song that sells a lot of sheet music or later on sells a lot of recordings, it would generally be in the ragtime style. Things like stride and boogie woogie were very popular in the teens and early 20s, and then in the sort of throughout the 20s, jazz, trad jazz, Dixieland jazz. Think of people like Louis Armstrong. That became the lingua franca of music. It became the idiom of pop music. Other forms of jazz then took over from that form of jazz. You had the swing music of the 30s with the big bands. And time for a water break. Good water. Always important to stay hydrated on a humid day like this. Um, and that music defined the idiom of pop music when there was a starlet singing a pop song in a film, because a lot of films had actors and actresses singing in the 30s. It would sound kind of sort of like a Glenn Miller or a Benny Goodman or an Artie Shaw type of song. And guess what? All of those men appeared in the films because that form of music was so dominant. Then moving into the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, a kind of watered down, and I don't say that in an insulting way, but a sort of softer version of the growing jazz idiom became the lingua franca, this idiom of pop music. Jazz from the late 40s onward was defined by bebop, where you had a composition structure of a head melody and then chords on which the musicians would improvise. Think early bebop pioneers like Charlie Bird Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And this type of jazz became the lingua franca of what we now refer to as traditional pop or classic pop. When you think of an arrangement or a backing band, even to a great singer of that era like Bing Crosby or Perry Como or the great Frank Sinatra, you tend to think of something jazzy. You think of that syncopated rhythm. You think of saxophone. You think of other horn instruments. This was the idiom of the pop music of the time. Now, other genres in the 50s became very popular as well. There was a huge calypso craze, calypso coming from the Caribbean, but people like Harry Belafonte, and ironically, before him, the very white Andrews sisters helped to popularize calypso. Now, calypso certainly didn't die. There are calypso singers to this day, but in terms of the American and the global pop markets that really stem out from America, calypso faded into the background, even though its main superstar, Harry Belafonte, continued to have a huge career for the rest of his very long and eventful life. And of course, just because jazz was dominating the pop music idiom in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even beyond other kinds of jazz in the 20s and 30s, that doesn't mean that there weren't other genres that were making a mark, albeit outside of that peak of the pop world. Country and Western music throughout the first half of the 20th century became increasingly popular. You could argue that in places like Nashville, country music was more popular than Sinatra or Perry Como style jazz, and that Western style music in places like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona was the defining cultural music of that region, even though overall it was the jazz based music that was coming out of singers who were mainly from the East Coast, because New York was, beyond a shadow of the doubt, the dominating place of pop culture at that time. This would go on to change by the end of the 60s, and a different genre would begin to become the defining genre of the pop music idiom by the end of the 60s. No prizes, rock and roll was here to stay, or was it? They certainly said it was at the time. Now, rock and roll emerged as an upstart genre in the 50s that owed a lot to country and western, a lot to rhythm and blues, which again, rhythm and blues, one of these genres outside the pinnacle of the pop music world, but very popular, less in a regional sense, but more in an ethnic sense. Black Americans were listening to R&B. They were listening to gospel music, which birthed R&B. R&B then became soul music in the 60s, but it still had those same roots. And now you had this rock and roll genre that was sort of a mix of European traditional folk music, Black American rhythm and blues, and mostly white American country and Western music. And rock and roll was here. You had Bill Haley and the Comets, you had Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, who thank you very much, Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, say that three times, all bopping along, and Richard Valens. They all took the same fateful flight. And they called that the day the music died, the day that those three died in a plane crash. But did rock and roll really die? Well, it definitely receded a bit after the three of them died, but it was not going anywhere, because by 62, 63, you had bands that were really shaping what became the dawning of the golden era of rock and roll. Rock and roll was birthed in the 50s, but its golden era of dominance began in the 60s with things like the Phil Spector catalog of artists, people like the Righteous Brothers, people who were more country tinged like the Everly Brothers, the Beach Boys were hugely influential in early rock and roll. And then the English bands that gained universal fame really set the standard of the genre globally. Think, obviously Beatles, Rolling Stones, the Animals. I love the Animals, the Kinks, the Who, the Dave Clark Five. Don't forget the Dave Clark Five. And rock and roll was off and running. And it got louder and harder as the decade wore on, because the technology allowed them to do so. The amplifiers for the electric guitars and the electric bass guitars got bigger. That meant the drum sets had to get bigger. That meant the keyboard amplification systems and the keyboards themselves had to get more sophisticated. And as all of this was happening, rock was conquering something. May have began as a so-called rebellious youthful genre where people like James Dean were rebelling against things to which they didn't have anything to rebel against. But by the late 60s, while the spirit of the lyrics might have been very rebellious about topics like Vietnam, etc., the genre's place in the pop music world was pretty damn well established. So much so that by the early 70s, the sound of pop music, the pop music idiom, was now rock and roll. Think people like the Carpenters at the top of the pop charts. They were a softer version of rock and roll. You had a rock and roll backbeat as opposed to swinging syncopation as the rhythmic pattern that now appeared on Sinatra records. Think the song My Way. That has a relatively subtle backbeat. It doesn't swing anymore. Same with Andy Williams and others of that traditional pop genre. Well, does this mean that jazz went away? It certainly did not. I would say some of the best jazz music of all time came in the very heady, fusiony 70s era. So while jazz certainly didn't die, it transformed just as it had transformed before. But unlike previous transformations, the jazz of the late 60s and 70s was not a domineering force as an idiom in pop music. Now it was rock and roll. Jazz had been dethroned, just like boogie woogie and ragtime before it. And all this while, like I said, blues, was waxing and waning in popularity. Blues, another genre that very much influenced rock and roll, and many and the first time really that blues was popular among white audiences was when the early rock and rollers from England mainly were listening to these imports of earlier Black American blues music and exporting it back to America. Blues became somewhat more popular among white audiences, and it's had various revivals over the years. Interestingly, blues has never had a revival among black audiences, and this was actually a topic discussed in the Wattstax documentary. In 1971, there was a wonderful music festival called Wattstax held at the LA Coliseum, featuring mostly soul musicians, funk musicians, a couple of blues musicians, and they remarked that yeah, the young black audiences, because it was an audience of young black American men and women. It was one part civil rights rally. Jesse Jackson was there, one part concert. Isaac Hayes was the headliner, and some of the blues guys, Albert King, I believe it was, said, "Well, the young black kids don't listen to blues." And as you get even into the 80s, we have people like Robert Cray. It's mainly white audiences buying that. So again, do genres die? Well, they might die with some segments of the population. Blues weirdly became more of a white genre post rock and roll. Things like country and western, outside of those regions that gave birth to it, wasn't all that popular elsewhere until the 1990s, when that changed as well. So again, genres don't necessarily, in this age of recording and the highly stratified music industry, they don't so much, die, but they become less prominent. Their position on this totemic pole of the pop music industry changes over the years. So it's the 70s. Now it's the 80s. We're all still rocking and rolling. Well, rock and roll does have some threats. It overcomes these threats, but there were some big threats because in the mid 70s, disco comes along and disco says, I am going to dethrone you, rock music, from the top of the pop music world food chain. And disco had some pretty big inroads. Every major rock artist in the pop world, or those who had pop aspirations, cut a disco record. Think Rod Stewart. One year in the late 60s, well, for a couple of years, he's playing with Jeff Beck, hard and heavy rock music with the jazz and blues influence. Then he's If You Like My Body and You Think I'm Sexy, to a disco beat, ironically played by great rock drummer Carmine Appice of the Vanilla Fudge. Even ELO get into it with the Discovery album, Disco Very. And there are so many other examples of people in the pop world who had previously been on the rock and roll side of things going through their disco phase. Pardon me. But disco eventually retreated at the end of the 70s, and while dance music adapted itself in the world of new wave, giving post disco a marriage with punk that gave it a new life with danceable new wave 80s music, the pop music idiom of the 80s was still mostly rock and roll driven, and the 80s did give birth to many well known hard rock and even heavy metal bands. Think of hard rockers like Van Halen, sort of pop rockers who had a hard edge like Def Leppard, and think of the emerging and increasingly popular subgenre of heavy metal, Judas Priest finally getting their flowers in the 80s, same with Iron Maiden, Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth coming out in the 80s, etc. So we're sailing into the 90s, and rock is arguably harder than ever. One of the top selling rock albums of the early 90s is the Black Album that could be none more black by Metallica. The kids are still a rocking, even though, as it always has been, R&B and soul are huge components of the pop music idiom. Rock and roll was the top selling genre, but the top selling artist of the 80s and early 90s, Michael Jackson, was of course an R&B and soul derived element of the pop music world, the king of pop no less. Now, in the 90s, rock was challenged, and it proved to be a far bigger challenge than disco. Although the grunge rock movement of the early 90s changed rock and some would say revived its fortunes among a younger generation, something else was happening, and it proved to be a much more worthy opponent in the long term than disco was. And this, of course, was hip hop. Now, hip hop has its origins in the 70s, and it really got the world's attention in the 80s, so much so that most NFL teams, notably Dub Bears, had a hip hop song. But it was only in the 90s when people like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Warren G and Tupac and Biggie Smalls and are we allowed to say his name without getting arrested? Puff Daddy, as he was known at the time. And as some people still call him, I still call him Puff Daddy, and maybe I'll pardon him. These people became very Ice T. Can't forget Ice T, an early pioneer, started in the 80s, much as Dr. Dre did with NWA, Ice Cube. But all of these names, Dre, Ice Cube, even Easy E, it was in the 90s when the kids started, in Ice T's own words. The young suburban white kids were taking down their Journey and Bon Jovi posters and putting up their NWA and Ice T posters. And the 90s were an era where rock and roll and hip hop happily coexisted in places like the MTV and on the walls of, of your teenage bedrooms at the time. Saying that and Puff Daddy in the same sentence rings very differently than it would have otherwise. We have to have a bit of fun at his expense, people. But, he's going to appeal. Let's let justice take its course. It's a free show, people, no complaints. By the early 2000s, though, rock and roll was definitely retreating. So much so that the early 2000s was an era where rock was losing, and I would objectively say lost its position at the pinnacle of this pop music totem. The early 2000s was dominated by people like Eminem, came out of the 90s but reached his zenith in the early 2000s. Names like 50 Cent, names like Kanye West, names like Jay-Z, they were the heroes of the pop world at this time. And yes, rock and roll bands, many of which were holdovers from the 90s, were still there, but it was really an era where hip hop became domineering. And it was likewise an era where rock and roll was now being challenged for its silver medal by the rise of pop infused country music. Like I said, country and western was always there, and it did have national audiences, but it was mainly, in the southern states with the Nashville sound, and parts of the Southwest, excluding much of California, with the Texan Western sound, hence country and Western music. But by the 90s, you had people like Garth Brooks, you had people like Shania Twain that were seriously challenging rock's dominance. And even Taylor Swift, people forget, Taylor Swift started as a Nashville country artist, and she realized, or people around her realized, that in order to gain more national fame, you've got to be a little less country and not a little more rock and roll, as the Osmonds decided to be, but a little more hip hop. And as now you can hear, the most recent albums, by recent I mean the last sort of 15 years of Taylor Swift's career, have all been what most pop music is, hip hop derived. So out goes the drummer with his backbeat, in goes the drum machine. Out goes the electric guitar, in goes the sequencers, the samplers, and the programmed synthesizers associated with the hip hop sound. And that is kind of where we are today, where today hip hop derived music, a watered down form, just as the pop music of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s was watered down jazz. Now we have watered down hip hop as the main lingua franca of pop music. So I did say, because it is just a few weeks away from Halloween, that we're going to talk about death, that which comes to all of us, lightning and I can't afford the sound effects, people, but I'll do like my own Foley man here. So these genres that I named, they didn't die, but some of them have to be put on life support. Some of them go into the old age home, but in the age of mass media, in the age where everything is recorded, in the age where every genre that I mentioned is Spotifyable and YouTubeable and Amazonable, I think that maybe no genre will ever die, that will not go into a situation like we did in the pre-industrial age of music, like Bach, where even a composer as technically sophisticated and as revolutionary as Bach retreated into insignificance before having to be rediscovered and revived. I'm not sure if that really applies anymore. Yes, there are ebbs and flows, as we saw with blues music, but death, total forgottenness, if you will. I don't know if that's a thing anymore because I think in the age of the music industry, we all get to live forever, suing each other for copyright infringement rather than accepting positive influence, having our catalogs purchased by major asset management firms, commodified, used to sell detergent and lemonade on TikTok. But dead? No. We all survive on the great infomercial in the sky that is TikTok, because what makes TikTok so revolutionary itself is that the advertisements are the videos. Cosmic, man. Maybe not. Anyway, that's what I think. Let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.